at 63rd and Western, and this is the building where the draft boards, 32 draft boards covering the whole south side of Chicago, were located here. And we rented an office in the building as a bookstore, and this is where we got into the draft board offices and removed a lot of the material, mountains of files and cards, and burned them outside. We did not endanger the building, or much less endanger the life of anybody in there or anywhere around here. So today I'm interviewing Bill Durkin, one of our group with the Chicago 15. And Bill, why don't you first describe where we are?
Well, Joe, we're in the small square outside the Germania building in Milwaukee, where the Milwaukee 14 in September 1968 burned about 10,000 draft files. So they had removed them from that building, I think it was late afternoon, and brought them across the street here and then burned them. They were a much bigger, more destructive action than the Catonsville 9. I think the Catonsville action only affected 400 draft files, something like that. And the Milwaukee 14, I think, had 8,000 or 10,000. And of course, in Chicago, we had 40,000 or 50,000. So that was the escalation of those actions. They became more and more destructive.
Okay. So now, did this action here, the Milwaukee 14, did that have an effect on you, an impact on you in terms of moving you to go further in your resistance to the war?
Probably not. I would have known about it. I was beginning my second year in college at that time, and I had enlisted with the Catholic Worker in Milwaukee, which I came to work at in December of that year. And that was the basis for the Milwaukee 14 group getting together, was the Casa Maria Catholic Worker House. So I got to know all of them in late 1968 and during 1969, and I met a number of the Catonsville 9 people. So I think altogether it was quite an influence, but it would have been later. And then probably a month before our action, sometime like that, was the trial of the Milwaukee 14 that went on for a couple of weeks, and I did attend parts of that. So Larry Rosebow was one of the Catholic Worker members who I worked with most closely, and he was, of course, a member of the Milwaukee 14 and was a considerable influence for me.
Yeah.
were you involved in the movement against the war in Vietnam before we got involved in the Chicago 15 action?
Not very much. I was primarily probably an observer to things. Through high school, it was more and more evident that it was a war that didn't have a good reason to it, I guess. And I grew up in Madison, so Madison, Wisconsin was kind of a hotbed of protests. So I was always aware of them. And in the summer of 1968, I was working in Chicago making radio flyer wagons. And so I was an observer to the Democratic Convention and the protests there, to me, watching kids getting beat up and so forth. But I wasn't really involved in it. So I think my involvement had much more to do with concerns about racism than about the war itself, other than that the war was a great symbol of racism in our country. So I was more influenced in that era by Martin Luther King and Muhammad Ali and people like that who opposed the war, but they opposed it primarily because it was such a racist war between the Asian body counts that were recorded every night on television and the high percentage of African Americans who were sent to fight there.
So our people were in this building, and at one point at about 5 a.m. they broke into the draft board offices and started gathering up all the files, and then at one point they started coming down this fire escape with all the files. I was waiting out here in the car, and I had the gasoline which we used to douse the draft material and set it on fire.
So were you registered with the draft yourself, or did you have a deferment?
I had a student deferment, which I gave up to join the Catholic worker movement in 1968, and I got involved in the Chicago 15 action during that time. I was part of the Catholic Workers, so I knew then I was going to refuse induction. So my kind of rationale for the action in part was I just assumed I'd do the same amount of time, regardless of whether I burned 40,000 files or if I refused induction. So, you know, if you looked at the Catonsville trial and the Milwaukee 14 trial, most of those people received 1 or 2 year sentences. And that was sort of a common sentence for people refusing induction. So the fact we were handled in a much more heavy-handed way in Chicago was not in my calculation.
The draft boards located here covered the whole south side of Chicago. And so the people who were registered here were members of minority groups, especially blacks and Hispanics, who were inducted and served in Vietnam in very disproportionate numbers. So part of our reason for choosing this particular set of draft boards was to dramatize that.
Here's what I wrote in a letter home back then. I have 58 men. Only 20 have high school diplomas. Average age, 19. Over and over I read, address of father, unknown. Education, 1 or 2 years of high school. Occupation, laborer, pecan sheller, gas station attendant, Job Corps. They had grown up in the ghetto or Appalachia or along the Rio Grande border or on a res. Kids with no place to go, no place but here. They were expendable, and they knew it. I was the clueless 24-year-old second lieutenant who had been put in charge of them.
What was your part in the action? What was your role? What were you doing?
I was a worker. I took the contractor bags and filled them with files and went up and down the fire escape to put them in the pile to be burned. I did participate in several weekend retreats we had as a group, as a growing group, in the weeks before. So I was really a part of that. But and I had 2 colleagues from Milwaukee, Ed Gargan and Bill Sweeney, who we were all pretty close friends. So the 3 of us were sort of together in this whole thing.
So you were filling the bags with the draft files and log books and then at one point bringing them down the back fire escape.
Right, and went back and forth. I don't know how many trips I made, but it was multiple trips.
Do not consider our action as an attack on any of you, personally. We mean no harm to any of you. We act to save lives and harm no one. After your anger has subsided, please reconsider what we have done. All of us are human beings, trying to live our lives as fully as possible. To us, this meant action. We're not sure what it means to you. We would like to know. We had to act, trying to end the murder of men in Vietnam and the rest of the world. 35,000 men is 35,000 too many. We act with peace and love, try to understand, and we will try to understand also. We will learn and grow together here. We are brothers and sisters. Our unity is real.
You know, our generation is a generation that was part of the Kennedy assassination cover-up and so on. So we just had a wholehearted view of the government as being dishonest. I did grow up in a family where my grandfather fought in World War I and my father in World War II, and in the rest of their lives, it was probably the biggest thing they talked about most frequently. So I did grow up in an atmosphere where you were supposed to either go to war or be a priest, and so when the Vatican II thing happened and the Kennedy assassination, those kinds of things in the '60s, it created a big distrust of sort of authority and kind of a willingness on people's part to challenge conventional authority.
So very shortly, the Chicago police arrived and took us away to police station and then to Cook County Jail, where we spent a few days before we were bailed out. We were first charged with burglary and arson by the state of Illinois, and then by the federal government with 4 counts in an indictment, including destruction of government property, interfering with the Selective Service System, and conspiracy to do those things. And then after a while, the state dropped their charges and we were prosecuted by the federal government. Our trial was held in the federal building in Chicago. Our trial lasted about a month in 1970. We tried to present some of our reasons for the protest action, but the judge basically refused to allow us to present anything about the Vietnam War or the draft.
How long did you serve in prison? Where were you, and how was that?
I served 2 years and then 3 years of parole and a couple of years of probation after that before the federal judge in Madison relieved me of the last 3 years or so of probation. You know, I'd say the prison experience overall was the biggest factor was how boring it was. It was really obviously lacking stimulation in many ways. In some parts it was fulfilling. I was one of the first federal inmates to be assigned to teach my fellow inmates who were studying to pass the GED. So I did that for a part of the time, and I also was put in a University of Kentucky college program for a while. because they were trying to increase their likelihood of success so they could get additional federal funding, which was really a scandalous thing. We started out, as all of us did, in Cook County Jail, which kind of, after that, everything else gets to be a little more pedestrian as far as a prison experience. I was transferred to El Reno, Oklahoma, and on the way from Cook County Jail to begin my federal sentence. And the federal marshals drove halfway to Kansas City, and those of us they were transporting, we were put in the Kansas City jail overnight before continuing on to El Reno, Oklahoma the next day. And the jail in Kansas City, I think to this day, is still on the 13th and 14th floor. And so at about 6 o'clock that night, there was a bomb scare, and the entire building was evacuated except the inmates on the 13th and 14th floor. So we all watched on television while the bomb squad came to detonate the bomb on the first floor, which taught me a lot about how prison was going to operate. I went to El Reno in July after being 35 days in the Cook County Jail. And El Reno in July in Oklahoma is about 105 degrees every day. So it was a huge transition to go from never seeing the sun in Cook County to being outdoors in 105 degrees. So I convinced them that I had been a barber on the street, so that I was assigned to the barber shop, which was the only air-conditioned place in El Reno for that inmates could be during the day, that could work. So I did that for about 4 months, and then we received orders to transfer to Milan, Michigan, which was going to be a lot closer to my family and my home. And so I was transported by bus, the federal bus, with 30 other inmates to Leavenworth. So I spent 3 weeks in Leavenworth. The way the federal system works, they only transfer you when the bus is full. So after 3 weeks, the bus was full, and then I was transferred to Terre Haute. And when I got to Terre Haute, I learned that the prison in Michigan, Milan, Michigan, that there had been some kind of riot, and so they weren't accepting more inmates. So I stayed in Terre Haute for 3 weeks, which Leavenworth and Terre Haute are pretty as hardcore as you can probably
maximum security.
Real maximum security. I remember somebody saying in Leavenworth that there wasn't anybody there for singing too loud in church, and that was a great understatement. So then I was transferred to Ashland, Kentucky, which was a medium security prison, and that's where I spent the last 18 months of my time.
Mm-hmm. That's where you were teaching GED?
It is,
yeah. And how much time would you spend each day doing that? Was it a pretty full-time job?
It was a full-time job, and it was an interesting thing. And the reason I say it was fulfilling, we had, I think, as I recall, about 600 inmates at Ashland, and all of them were between like the ages of 18 and 24, and I would have been 19, 20, 21 in that time. But about half the population was Appalachian kids from West Virginia and Tennessee and Ohio and Kentucky, and they were there largely for selling moonshine or transporting moonshine or stealing cars and driving across state lines. And the other half of the inmates were inner city kids, black kids from Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, more often in for bank robbery or other kind of serious federal offenses. So I taught both of those populations, and which really for me was a huge learning experience, and in many ways kind of a fulfilling experience, I guess you could say.
Had you started college before we got involved in the action, or?
I had
You had started
3 semesters in, I guess. So I did go back to school, but not very long after I was released to Madison, I was hired by Governor Lucey's administration when he was the elected Democratic governor right around the time I was being released. And one of his changes was, this was 1972, people with felony convictions were not allowed to enroll in state universities in Wisconsin, and his Board of Regents had changed that, and so I was hired to work with inmates in all the state prisons in Wisconsin to help them get admitted to college and technical school when they were being released. So I did that for a couple of years, and so I really took advantage of my my experiences, I guess. as part of that, one of my memorable moments was I was appointed to a study commission to study prison industries in Wisconsin, and along with a number of business and union leaders. And one of the first things our group did was to take a tour of Leavenworth to look at the industries there for prisoners. So I returned to Leavenworth in a suit and tie that no one else in the group probably realized I knew those 35 granite steps going up to enter that intimidating prison.
And what kind of work have you been in over the years?
I stayed working in the governor's office for a few years. I became head of a special project to reform welfare in Wisconsin. And then I did return and finish a college degree in Milwaukee. And for most of the time since then, I've been a private fundraising consultant for 20 some years, almost 30 years. So I assist nonprofit groups with raising private money primarily for significant capital projects.
First of all, the Vietnam activity was really pretty modest compared to prior times in our American history. There were 12,000 anti-war protesters killed in New York City in the Civil War, for example, protesting the draft in a 3-day period. In World War I, the president asked for 1 million volunteers to sign up to join the army to go overseas for World War I. He got 73,000 people, and that's when he created our Selective Service System. So that's what our actions dated to, was that kind of failure back then. We think our prison sentences were difficult. There were actually 17 Vietnam or draft resistors sentenced to death. 142 were sentenced to life in prison, 3 to 50 years, and 57 to 25 years. And all those people did those sentences until they were pardoned in 1933 by President Roosevelt. So I think the Vietnam thing was relatively modest compared to some of that. In World War II, there were 12,000 people sent to prison for refusing induction. And in Vietnam, there were fewer than 3,000. So just to give you some idea of some of those differences. The draft that Rick has described to us was really central to all that, and it really didn't change. Actually, General Hershey was the director of the Selective Service from 1940 to 1970, just to give you an idea of how little change went on there. I thought it was a great line when Nixon appointed a commission to study the draft and to recommend changes in it. One of the quotes of that study, which led to the lottery replacing the Selective Service, they said the Selective Service administrators were ancient, the building was collapsing, and office systems were something out of a Dickens novel. So that was kind of, when you talked about no security in the draft boards, that's because that's how they were run. There were actually 4,000 draft boards, so the 34 that we had an influence on in Chicago was such a tiny part of it. There were 41,000 people that served on those draft boards, those volunteers, Rick, you referred to. And in 1967 is the first time women were allowed. Up until 1967, women weren't allowed to do that. So the resistance, you've summarized the kind of resistance to Vietnam. I think ultimately there were somewhere close to 300 draft board actions in the United States, anywhere from one person. I think the number arrested in Chicago was the largest that was ever arrested for standing by an action of that sort. So there are a few things that I just want to summarize about the Chicago 15 that I thought would be of interest. One is that there were very few instances afterward when people stood around and accepted being arrested out of those 300 draft actions. So I don't know what we were thinking, but we were really kind of one of the last of that group. We're the first people that went into a draft board when the offices were closed and when there were no employees there. All the previous actions were done in broad daylight and in front of lots of people. So I'm not sure what caused us to be so clever about that, but we're also the first ones to do it on a weekend. All the rest up until that time were done in weekdays. We also had the first gag order from a federal judge in one of our trials. In February, we weren't allowed to talk anymore about what we did or why we did it, and that was later overruled by the appeals court as unconstitutional. We received the longest prison sentences, and actually they went down after the Chicago action. So I'm not sure why that is, other than we destroyed so many files. I think that was, and Fred Chase not standing up for the judge probably didn't help. We were really sort of the end of the symbolic period. By destroying 40,000 records, it wasn't really like the Catonsville thing of three or 400. We were the only group where a majority of the people arrested skipped our trial, so that's another claim to fame for us. And we were, finally, we were the only group, up until that time anyway, that had people of draft age involved. Interestingly, the ones previous to that were actually quite older than we were. So we had about a half dozen people who were of draft age, so that was a different thing as well.
How long did you guys spend in prison?
Most of us a couple of years, out of a 5-year sentence. But some of the sentences were, in other cases, were 3 months or 1 year or something, considerably less. But that was Chicago, and it was after the convention was here. It was after the trial at Chicago 7.